Before I start, I should say that in sort of preparing things for today, I went through some of the files that I had at home, and these included the obituary that Tom gave on Pete McCormick, which was something that wasn't written for him by someone else. It was written by him, and it brought tears to my eyes again as I reread it. I'm here to present some of my remembrances about the Carleton Psychology Department up to my move to Toronto in the year 2000. It will also include material from the files that I kept on the department and the psychology faculty. If there are errors in what I remember, I ask you to please point them out to me so that I can correct them before I pass this paper on to the archives. Bob Wake, who was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, received his PhD in adolescent psychology from McGill in 1950, and in 1952 was appointed the first full-time psychology faculty member at Carleton College, then situated on First Avenue in the Glebe. He was chair of the department until his sabbatical leave in 1961-62. For years in the Ottawa community, Bob Wake's name was synonymous with psychology at Carleton. His connections in the community were numerous, including the schools, the courts, and such United Way agencies as the Council on Aging and the Youth Services Bureau. With many community groups, he led the way and then got the younger members of the department involved in these groups. For instance, I later joined the board and was president of the Council on Aging and of the Youth Services Bureau. In 1968, Bob moved to St. Patrick's College, which had recently been acquired by Carleton University, and there established the community-based program in psychology and started the program in criminology. He returned to the main Carleton campus when the St. Patrick's group was reintegrated into the main campus psychology department. And on the main campus, the undergraduate program in criminology became the largest group of psychology majors. He retired in 1981 and died in 1993. As part of the instruction in the developmental and personality courses in the 1950s, Bob Wake set up field trips to some of the facilities in the region. These included the Kingston Penitentiary, the Reform School at Alfred, and the Hospital for Retarded Individuals in Smiths Falls. In 1964, I was encouraged to continue these field trips, and I did so into the 1970s. The female students were not allowed into the Kingston Pen, and they went to the women's prison in Kingston while the male students were at the Kingston Pen. In the late 60s, one of the male students had quite long hair, and this created a sensation when we visited the Kingston Pen. I was informed that these visits would be discontinued if this ever happened again. The visits to Alfred usually ended with a football game between the inmates at Alfred and the male Carleton students. All of these field trips were discontinued in the early 1970s. Rusty Went was born in Alberta, and in his early career taught in the Alberta Public Schools. He was an undergraduate at the University of Alberta and did graduate work at Alberta and McGill. He was involved as a part-time lecturer at Carleton from 1950 to 1957, and in 1957 he became the second full-time member of the psychology department at Carleton. He was chair of the psychology department from 1961 to 1970, and as you heard from Tom, he gave up the chair following his heart attack. During his term as chair, the psychology doctoral program was established in 1966, and we've heard from the first graduate of the PhD program, June Pym, here this morning. Rusty's administrative skills as chair and dean had much to do with the expansion of the psychology department to its position as the largest department at Carleton. From 1964 to 1968, he was the first dean of students at Carleton, and then from 1971 to 76, he was dean of arts, and then in 1976 became the first dean of social sciences. He retired in 1982 and died in 1993. Rusty Wendt and Brian Laver, both military types, were responsible for the strong emphasis on the history of psychology in the undergraduate and graduate programs at Carleton. In the 1960s, Carleton was a small university. In the second and third year, the psychology courses, all four full courses at that time, were statistics, experimental, learning, history, child, personality, and social. There was one section of each, with an average of enrollment of about 50 students. From the 60s to the 80s, the rules about smoking gradually changed. In 1964, smoking was allowed in seminars and even in lectures, in offices, and even in some exams. The last of these areas to become smoke-free were the professors' offices, a prohibition some of us thought would never happen. And I do remember one of my female colleagues used to lock herself in her office, and Bill Walther would go down and hammer on the door saying, "Smoke, police." When Brian Laver and I were appointed to the psychology department in 1964, it brought the number of the faculty in the department up to 10. This was before the democratization of university governance with new university government, or NUG as it's called. So the psychology chair, Rusty Wendt, was appointed by the president without consultation or voting. All psychology chairs were elected after 1969 as the provisions of NUG came into effect. Of the 10 psychology faculty in 1964, 5 of whom were Canadians, 3, McCormick, Marshall, and Walther, had done their graduate work at Iowa. Learning with Ken Spence, particularly, is what we heard about from them. 2, Donald and Bernhardt at Michigan, social psychology with Ted Newcomb, and Raplogle at McGill, physiological with Don Hebb and Brenda Milner. 2, Wendt and Laver had been part-time lecturers in psychology before the department was established. There was a strong developmental background in the undergraduate training of some, especially at the Toronto Institute of Child Study with Bill Blotz. These fields, along with history and the expertise involved in them, were to dominate the course offerings and orientation of the department for at least the first 25 years of its existence. Rusty Wendt maintained a strong anti-clinical bias, suggesting that clinical psychology should be left to the University of Ottawa. He, along with President Dunton, also worked to keep a faculty of education out of Carleton. In 1964, there were 4 fourth-year honors students in the department and 2 MA students. The majority of the teaching assistants until the mid-70s were senior undergraduates, many of whom went on to become university professors. As Carleton was small and most of the faculty were not from Ottawa, there was a great deal of socializing within the group. In the 1960s, Rusty Wendt started a monthly faculty poker night, males only, except for one evening when we were short of players, and so Joe Tomba was asked to sit in and wiped us all out. The poker night moved around to different faculty members' homes each month, and the most you could lose in an evening was $3, unless you were the host, when you had to provide beer and sandwiches. When the new Loeb Social Sciences building was being planned, there was a great deal of faculty consultation, particularly dominated by the sociology department's emphasis on faculty interaction, which won the day with the establishment of a faculty coffee lounge down on the first floor of the Loeb building. And much to the displeasure of the dean, Rusty established a psychology department coffee lounge for the psychology department on the 5th floor in what later became the photocopy room. Most of the psychology department gathered there each morning, and it was here that the chairman pontificated and communicated with the faculty. And if you did not go for coffee, you had no idea what was going on in the department. In 1964, with half of the faculty had American university training, and many of the new appointments in the next 15 years were Americans, and almost all had American graduate school experience. As chair of the undergraduate program in the 1960s, I introduced a fairly extensive program revision, which included the introduction of half courses, leaving introductory psychology, the honor seminars, and industrial psychology as the only psychology full courses. At this time, half courses were rare in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and not at all popular. However, in the psychology department, with the strong American influence and experience, there was little or no opposition to this. It provided room for half courses reflecting the growing number of varied interests of the faculty, and so we were able to expand the course offerings beyond those core courses that dominated the undergraduate program in the beginning. My first position in the department involved half-time as student counselor, the only psychological counseling available on campus at that time. After a few years, psychology counseling moved out of the department. I stayed in, expanded, and eventually settled in the health services. Many early appointments in the department involved a commitment for the individual to set up psychological labs. In the 60s, these were on the ground floor of Patterson Hall. Nan Donald, in her social psychology training at Michigan, set up social psychology labs. Pete McCormick, with his Iowa training, set up learning labs. And Ann Replogle, with her McGill training, set up animal labs. When the Loeb building was being designed, Rusty turned over the responsibility for these labs to these people. Dan Donald with the social, largely small group labs. Pete McCormick designing the undergraduate teaching lab and the learning labs, and Ann Replogle dealing with the animal facilities and labs. Eleanor Burwell and I were asked to design the developmental labs, including a preschool with one-way vision mirrors into the, among other places, into the children's toilets. An area of significant social interaction, but causing problems with voyeurs, the students who came in their lunch hour to sit and watch what was going on there. So it was necessary for us to cover up the vision mirrors into the toilets, except when they were used for legitimate observation. The labs for the psychology department in the Loeb building were located in A tower of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors. With the establishment of the preschool, Eleanor Burwell and I became more and more involved with early childhood education. We were both members of the Early Childhood Education Training Committee and taught courses in the Early Childhood Education program, which eventually ended up residing at Algonquin College. In the 1960s and 1970s, Spring Conference, which began in 1950, always had a strong psychology department presence, encouraged by Rusty Wendt and perhaps by the tradition of booze. In the 60s, almost all psychology department members attended Spring Conference. Chairs of Spring Conference from the psychology department in the 80s and 90s included Pete McCormick, myself, and Tim Pitchell. In these years, many of the psychology department members made presentations, and in the first 50 years of Spring Conference, the psychology department held the record with the most faculty presentations from a single department. As we moved into the 70s and beyond, some of the faculty became involved with international exchanges. These included Lloyd Strickland in Russia with the University of Leningrad, myself in Russia with the University of Leningrad, and in Poland at the University of Warsaw, of Lublin, and Krakow, Jack Kelly and myself in China, and Bill Petrusik in Australia. The students at the University of Leningrad were particularly interested in lectures from me on psychoanalytic theory, particularly Freud and Jung, and on recent developments in therapy of the Esalen variety. When I returned to Carleton, I heard that there had been complaints from the Soviet embassy about the content of these courses. In 1965, Bill Walther and I produced a series of psychology lectures for University of the Air, broadcast on CTV. This was the beginning of our involvement with psychology on TV. In the 1970s, Carleton started to offer courses for credit on TV, and many of the psychology faculty became involved in this venture. In the 1990s, the psychology department was the first to make it possible to receive a pass degree entirely from TV courses. Without this move to TV courses, the psychology department would not have been able to accommodate the great numbers of students wanting psychology courses in the 80s and 90s, and we would have completely floundered. In the 1970s, introductory psychology had become too large and a problem. So Bill Walther reorganized the course into a number of modules given by a group of graduate level students to smaller groups of students. This was eventually abandoned when introductory psychology became part of the psychology department's TV offerings. I don't know whether that was why it was abandoned or... In 19